Are you confused about how levels work at Google? I recruited at Google for 5 years, and I can tell you oftentimes this is a very confusing subject. In this video, I want to simply uncover a few critical items about the levels. I really want to focus in on why creating a strong relationship with your recruiter is so important, how leveling ultimately is assessed, and then what do you do once you're in the door? So let's dive right in. What are levels? Levels are simply a way to classify expectations and responsibilities for the job. And many large organizations, large tech organizations especially, use levels because it creates structure. And this is both when recruiting, it creates better retention because there's better expectation setting. And then on the financial side, it's more clearly defined pay bands and creates more consistent pay equity internally. And so if you're coming from a smaller organization, you may be less familiar with levels, but they're very common, especially again in large tech. Item two, years of experience. The higher the level, the more years of experience. And what I want to capture in this section is the fact that there's probably more flexibility and variability than you think in regards to levels. And one of the most important items to remember, years of experience means in a like or similar role. And this is a very important distinction because they are very different. So take myself, for example. I went into Google with 13 years of experience, but only 4 years of experience as a recruiter. So I was hired as an L4. And so for the purposes of this video, I just want to cast a wide net, technical and non-technical, because almost all the data that you'll find online is for more technical roles, engineering roles. L3, and for the purpose of this video, everything will be level 3, we'll change it to L3, for example. So L3, this is absolutely junior level. This could be new grads and typically up to about 3 years of experience. L4 is more experienced. Usually it starts at about 3 years of experience up to 10 years. Or if you completed your PhD program, you're typically coming in as an L4. And yes, you can be hired as an L4 with 10 years of relevant experience. L5, we're getting to a little bit higher experience level, usually at least 5 years of experience, up to 10 years plus. And I absolutely did hire people with 15 years of relevant experience as L5s. Now, L6 is going to be more senior, typically 10 plus years of experience, up to 20 or more years. And then L7 is going to be a little bit more senior, 12 years up to 20 plus years. And yes, at both these levels, you can be hired with 20 plus years of relevant experience. It happens. Now, L8, we're going to stop at L8 for the purpose of this video. So that's a director level. And it's also more of a principal engineering level. And it's pretty rare to get into these roles with less than 15 years of experience. But of course, there's always edge cases. There's always outliers. And while you'll hear that Google never hires externally at the director level, principal engineer level roles, they actually do. They have a team that's just dedicated to hiring L8 and above. So it does happen. And obviously, with all this information, I'm casting a pretty wide net because what I saw in my career is that these levels actually have a much bigger range than is shared externally. Item 3, the recruiter conversation. The vast majority of our clients, the vast majority of candidates don't even know what level they're interviewing for at Google. And this is a major challenge and an item that can simply be resolved by asking. Your recruiter at least has an idea of the target level, always. And this is based on conversations with the hiring manager. It's by taking a look at your overall years of experience, what level they should be targeting. And how do you make sure that the recruiter is telling you the level? You ask them. Of course, you want to be gracious and kind, but push back if they don't give you an answer. And if you don't know and they're not telling you, you could say to your recruiter, Jane, hey, Jane, my best guess is that Google would target me at an L5. Is this a safe assumption? Because if we pose the level, maybe, just maybe, we can get a little bit more information. And here is the critical data point that's not being discussed anywhere. Your recruiter has to have an idea of level before the interview because that's how the interview panel is set. I know, mind blown, right? So what do I mean? You won't get hired as an L5 if your interviewers are not at the right level, meaning that you should not have L4s on your interview panel if you're interviewing for an L5. So as your recruiter going in, I might say, okay, they might be on the cusp of L4, L5, but I'm only going to bring in interviewers that are at an L5 or a higher level just to set you up for success. And honestly, I would try and bring in at least a couple of L6s, maybe an L7, because people at the L5 level, they're actually going to be tougher on you because they're going to be comparing themselves to you. And what's not really being discussed is that recruiters are probably oftentimes making this error early on and not actually setting you up for success and making you more likely to be down leveled by not setting the panel appropriately. So this is a big deal and why it's so important to have that leveling conversation with your recruiter right away. Item 4 is level assessment. So how is level being assessed in the interview process? And it's actually very straightforward. There are two main factors: relevant past experience and interview performance. So let's start with the past experience. Both your interviewers and hiring committee are trying to confirm that your past experience aligns with the level. And this goes on both sides of the coin again. So too many years of experience or not enough years of experience. And so this is an item that they're going to look at in the beginning. The interviewers will look to confirm it, and ultimately hiring committee will use this as a guide if needed. Meaning sometimes it's very straightforward that you're an L5. Sometimes for hiring committee, for example, it needs more scrutiny, and that's why relevant experience will be so important. For example, when I hired program managers, there was always an HC member that heavily scrutinized relevant experience, and this was often a breaking point for them. So L5 was always a tricky level, and that's why I bring it up, because oftentimes this hiring committee member would say, hey, they have 20 years of relevant experience. If they can't meet the L6 bar now, why should we hire them as an L5? And remember, hiring committee's goal is to hire you for that role and for the long term. The interview feedback should also be able to confirm your level. And they are looking at the overall quality of your answers. They're looking at complexity. They're looking at depth. And it's not always that clear cut to say what distinguishes the line between L4 or L5. But for example, if you are interviewing for an L5 role and your answers aren't super complex, especially from an example standpoint, or the depth of your problem solving isn't really going into the weeds, these might be indicators that it's better to hire you as an L4 to set you up for success. So while it feels like a lot goes into assessing these levels, these are really the key items. Now, past interview feedback can help as well. If you've shown improvement from previous interviews in regards to providing more complex answers, more depth in problem solving, HC can see this as growth and a reason to hire you at L5. Lastly, internal references can tip the scale on level. It's a less likely scenario, but if hiring committee, for example, had 3 strong internal references all speaking to your leadership capabilities, this could result in them confirming L5. Item 5, down leveling versus up leveling. This really needed to be its own item because there's a lot of confusion on this subject. Hiring committee will always be conservative with leveling, and because HC takes this conservative approach, it's not uncommon to be down leveled. And what are the stats? Well, I don't really know, but maybe a third of candidates are getting down leveled, but that's even hard to say because oftentimes you're going in with a range like targeting L4 or L5, meaning I would set you up as an L5, but I could have potentially been looking at you as an L4 as well. Just don't be surprised if the level comes in a little bit lower than you expect. And this is to set you up for success. Google wants you to be successful, get promoted quickly, stay engaged and motivated, and setting you up on the right career path. Let's flip the coin and talk about up leveling. So this is definitely less common. And if we were to cast a percentage on this one, let's say 1%. So it's really, really uncommon. Now, there are a couple of scenarios. Let's say you come in, you have 4 interviews, you get strong hires across the board. Hiring committee might just say, look, based on relevant experience, based on these interviews, let's just hire this person as an L6. They deserve it. That's where they should be. Hiring committee can also recommend and say, look, we think they're pretty close with a couple of additional interviews. It might be worth doing 1 or 2 more interviews to assess a higher level. Now, on the flip side, the recruiter can look at the feedback and discuss with the hiring manager or a hiring committee member before hiring committee and say, hey, if we did a couple of additional interviews, would that push it over the edge? Would that be enough to get to an L6? Now, lastly, there is an up-level appeal process. A recruiter, with the support of a hiring manager, can go through this process. Sometimes there's no additional data. It's just based on reasoning. And again, sometimes it will require additional interviews. And while you can ask to be up-leveled, it's pretty uncommon. And if you think that this is a scenario that's likely going to work, it's just, again, the percentages are not in your favor. Item 6, internal items. Okay, congrats, you've made it to Google. Now what? Well, it's important that you're referencing the requirements for success at your level and looking at the requirements for the next level and continuing to have that conversation with your lead. And remember, they alone cannot promote you. So when the time is right, you'll actually be put in front of a promotion committee and it will be a group decision. Now, you can be promoted off cycle, which is the middle of the year. Google's fiscal year is also the calendar year. So this is maybe 10 to 20%. And then the other 80% are being promoted at the end of the year, at the end of the bigger performance cycle. Now, the last piece that you want to know, and there's a lot of good data on this online, typically you want to be performing at that next level for about 2 quarters, because that will really show that you can be at that L6 level and that you should get promoted, for example. This is why it can be a little bit tricky to get that first promotion quickly, because usually you're coming into the organization and spending the first 3 to 6 months really learning and growing. So to really kind of perform at that level and get promoted within a year is less common. For the first role, think 2 years. A couple of other items that are just really interesting is just because you're in L3, for example, it does not mean that you will not work at the same complexity or scale as an L6. You'll be given big things, and if you perform, you will get promoted quickly. Now, secondly, levels are not shared internally. For example, if you go to the Teams page and you're looking at product managers, you wouldn't be able to tell who is an L4 versus an L6, but it is common for employees to share levels with each other, but that's up to you. Item 7, ego. This is an item that I've discussed many times in my lives, which are every 10 a.m. Pacific, every Wednesday. And level is ego. The only thing you should care about is compensation. And ego can lead to bad decisions on whether to take the job or not. So let me leave you with this final example. In 2016, I was hiring machine learning engineers, software engineers for Google Cloud. Obviously, this is a super competitive, super difficult position to pass the interview process. I had a candidate, they passed the interview process, and they had offers from both Google and Facebook. Facebook was L6, Google was L5, Google's compensation was higher, and it would be working with 2 world-renowned people in the ML space. They chose Facebook. Why? Ego. It's not a good decision. Always go with compensation. Good luck.